say to yourself, why are there so many vineyards? Why is it so complicated? The answer is buried in religion. Because you have to remember that the dukes of Burgundy were the original landholders, but they gave most of that land away to the church. Why? Because they couldn't do anything with it. There was nothing there, they couldn't grow crops. It was land that was completely useless. They gave it to the church. Well, the church had this land. They said, well, we should do something with it. So nobody's quite sure how they figured out to grow grapes there, whether it was indigenous plants that they found growing in the forest, or whether some enterprising monk came up with the idea of planting grapes there. But what they concluded after a time, several hundred years, was they began to notice differences between that vineyard and this vineyard and that vineyard. And here's the significance, is that Burgundy came out, and the organization of Burgundy came out of religious fanaticism. And religious fanaticism was the reason that they said it's not sufficient that we simply notice differences between here and there. Because you'd say, well, just because you notice a difference, so what? Well, because they were monks, they said that the difference, they attributed it to being messages from God. And so the reason that you only find 2 grape varieties, actually, there are exceptions to that, but essentially 2 grape varieties. And in 95% of the world's other wine regions are all blends of grapes. Single variety wines are rare in the world. Most of them are blends because it's a lot easier to make something interesting out of multiple grapes, because in Bordeaux, for example, where they have 5, if you have rain early in the harvest season, you don't use that. You use the stuff that harvested late, or vice versa. It's a lot easier to make stuff that's interesting out of more grapes than fewer grapes because you have a greater margin for error. Well, in this case, the monks said, we're not only not going to blend away. Why? Because blending muddles the message, and it was the clarity of the message that they were after. And so when they tasted something that was different, they said, no, all of a sudden, now we've changed. And because we've changed in terms of taste profile, the vineyard stops here. And over here has a different taste profile. We're going to draw another vineyard. And so when you look at a map of Burgundy, if you've ever wondered, how on earth did this mosaic ever develop? Because it is the most uneconomic way to organize a series of vineyards that you could possibly think of. Why have 1,600 vineyards? And economically speaking, it makes no sense. Well, the reason is that somebody saw differences, and the reason that those differences were preserved rather than them blurring vineyard lines is to say that it had a message from God, and therefore not only was it worth preserving, and here's the key point as to understanding why Burgundy looks like it is today, is that the monks said not only these differences exist, not only can we perceive them, but they're worth celebrating. And as a result, even after the church fell in 1789, the peasants that took over afterwards, the bourgeois, didn't take the equivalent of a geological eraser and start changing the lines. They left them to where they were, because after some 600 years under one church system and close to 1,000 years before that, they had a chance to look very, very carefully at what each vineyard had to say. And so today, we don't really understand the passion behind it, but we can understand the methodology behind what they did, and to try and explain why Burgundy is the most complicated wine region in the world, but it's not an accident. It is not something that just evolved because. There were logical reasons in the context of fanatics, in which we might look at today and say, well, this makes no sense, you wouldn't do it that way. But that's why a Burgundy map looks the way it does today. And so when you taste this, there were generations upon generations upon generations of people that preceded us that said, there's a coherency with wines that are made from where these come from. There's a similarity, and we're going to preserve that similarity. And therefore, it's worth drawing the lines where they are. And it's interesting how you can have a village wine that juxtaposes directly with a Grand Cru. Normally you would say, well, that quality should blend over. you would think that the qualitative differences that they perceived would be gradual. Well, the map would put a lie to that. They would say, well, not necessarily. Usually that's the case, but not always. There is a historical context that makes these wines more interesting. And when you have an appreciation for that, it adds to your appreciation of the glass in front of you that's not just 100% gustatory. And there's nothing wrong with saying, gee, it tastes good, let's drink. But I also think that understanding some of the subtleties that preceded why this is in the glass the way it is, meaning one grape, and why somebody took great pains to say it's only from that vineyard. And Michael brought up a really interesting point while we were chatting about it, is that when you look at the typical New World label, it's the name of the vigneron, of the winemaker, that's splashed front and center. When you look at the label of a typical Burgundy, if you look at a Premier Cru like this, it's the name of the commune, Meursault. The vineyard is next, smaller, Charme, and all the way at the bottom in little tiny print is usually the name of the vigneron. And this again came out of religious significance as well, because the monks that made these wines in the early days were humble before God. And they said that the magic that's in this glass is God's work. It came from the dirt. It came from the microclimate. What I added here was competence, but not magic. And so the religious significance of that the greatness of the wines is in dirt and not here is why you see just little subtle things like wine labeling that you don't typically see otherwise. And so this whole notion of how Burgundy came to pass actually has ramifications for just something simple like a wine label.